Now, the notion of PGMs, ostensibly, when we as a country have sort of justified the sales and the open door policy to them using them, it's because it's going to reduce civilian casualties because they're so precise that you wouldn't have indiscriminate bombing. Will you just speak to that a little bit? Because, and I guess I sort of had a notion of this, but as of the writing of this piece, which was 9 days ago, there were 98,000 buildings in Gaza that had been destroyed.
Yeah.
Obviously, we're now, close to 20,000 dead in Gaza. And you would imagine, over the past 10 days, there's been continued bombing. So probably hundreds, if not thousands, more buildings. But with every one of these buildings, there's a chance, obviously, there's dead people underneath them. It is astonishing. And it sort of seems to, what does it say about this concept of precision-guided munitions that are ostensibly used to save civilian lives? It sounds more like they're just able to target, maybe they're able to target journalists or doctors or activists, or more readily. What's happening from your perspective with these?
Yeah, so precision guided munitions, so those directed bombs, often guided by a satellite, have been often built, particularly by the Biden administration, as a way to reduce collateral damage and civilian harm. In a case like what we are seeing right now in Palestine, however, when we are seeing PGM fragments and US-made PGM fragments in the wake of strikes on refugee camps in the case of Jabalia, or under the evacuation line in South Gaza, it is very clear that these are being used with devastating effect on civilian infrastructure. And the US has tacitly acknowledged in the past that in the hands of a military without the capacity or the political will to protect civilians, precision-guided munitions will be particularly deadly. So in 2016, for example, lawyers within the State Department warned the Obama administration that its staffers could be held accountable for war crimes because of the precision-guided munitions that had been supplied to the Saudi-led air campaign in Yemen. And that was the first impetus to initially stopping precision-guided munitions as the first sort of sales that went through to Saudi. So the Biden administration knows very well the impact and effect that precision-guided munitions have in the hands of a military who has been abundantly clear that it does not adhere to either proportionality or distinction norms.
I want to slow down with this in terms of the Yemen example, because it seems to me that this may be a model to be replicated. I mean, we've heard U.S. government officials say they're supposedly in late November they're no longer discriminately bombing, which implies that the U.S. knew that they were indiscriminately bombing with these precision guided missiles, and claiming that they're no longer doing it. I mean, I think there's that's arguable, but at the very least, if I'm looking at this as a legalistic matter, it certainly indicates that there was an awareness this was going on, and there doesn't seem to be a response. Just walk us through a little bit about this with Yemen, because we were providing supposedly defensive weaponry for Saudi Arabia, is my understanding, and ostensibly to have some type of constructive engagement so that we could convince them to pull back more, which also was either just a farce of an excuse or very ineffective. The OLC, is that what you're saying? The Department of Justice said you could
state
be
L, so legal lawyers within state.
Okay, and so do we know if lawyers within state have had a look at what's going on in Gaza and had any response?
I do not have any insight into what State L is talking about. I would be very surprised if there was somebody who is not looking into this right now, particularly given the history of the Saudi example. and the extent to which the United States has trained and equipped what most legal experts are saying amounts to ethnic cleansing in the Gaza Strip. So the bombs that Israel is dropping are really big. They're 1,000 to 2,000 pounds. When one of these drops, the ground basically turns into soup. And so for context, the heaviest bombs that were dropped in the US campaign to liberate Mosul and Raqqa from ISIS were 500 pounds. And their use was extremely controversial among targeting experts because it was just too big. For some place like Gaza to be repeatedly dropping bombs of this size and scale is devastating, and there's absolutely no way it could be done in any way that is adhering with the law of armed conflicts principles of both proportionality and distinction, so making every effort to distinguish between combatant and non-combatants.
And how much in that calculation, how much does the fact that Gaza is one of the most densely populated, the most densely populated places on Earth, how does that factor in? Like, is there an algorithm when someone is looking at this from a legal standpoint?
There's not an algorithm I'm aware that lawyers use. I am aware that 972, an Israeli magazine, did a good deal of reporting on artificial intelligence algorithms, which were being used to calculate the level of, quote, collateral damage that would be coming from each strikes. And there is concern even within the Israeli targeting apparatus that the response has been disproportionate.
What else can you tell us about the way that that shipments are going there? So they have a basically an open door policy to a stockroom full of weapons that is that seemingly seems to be out of the reach of both congressional oversight and even the executive administration oversight, because there's already a sort of like you've got a coupon for as much as you want, sort of shopping spree. Are there other mechanisms that the administration is using to sort of cloud the transparency in terms of what kind of weaponry we're providing for Israel?
Yeah, so first I will note which the National Defense Authorization Act, which is supposed to be passed soon, has extended this waiver on precision-guided munitions so that the sort of blank check and lack of transparency can continue for another 3 years. To your point, there is also an amendment that appears to be trying to get a stock or a handle of what is actually still in the war reserve stockpile for Israel and the amount of precision-guided munitions just for sort of an accounting purpose, because that is something which has been sorely lacking in the past. But we're seeing a lot of mechanisms used. So for example, in theory, there is something called an emergency waiver under the Arms Export Control Act, where if the secretary or the president acting through the Secretary of State certifies that something is truly an emergency, normal transparency and congressional oversight measures can be bypassed. And they just did this, the Biden administration just did this with a series of tank shells that are going to be sent to Israel. So that's some of that 122 and 155 millimeter artillery that's going to be used in tank assaults and presumably in Gaza. There have also been 15,000 bombs and 50,000 other forms of bombs, 50,000 artillery shells, 15,000 bombs transferred, notwithstanding that war stockpile transfer. So there is just a ton of weapons flowing from a ton of different areas and with a ton of different authorizations.
And just to be clear, all of these open spigots are spigots that could theoretically be closed, right? I mean, in terms of like leverage, if there was, the argument that we don't have any leverage here, these spigots can be closed, I would imagine, with a phone call.
That is correct. And I would also point out that it is U.S. law would seem to require that. So Section 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act prohibits U.S. security assistance from going to states which are engaged in a consistent pattern of gross violations of international human rights. The targeting that we have seen the Israelis engage in and the probable war crimes certainly rise to that level. Section 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act says that no assistance shall go to a government that prohibits the access of U.S. humanitarian aid, which Israel seems to be certainly doing in Gaza. And the Biden administration's own conventional arms transfer policy set forth a more likely than not standard, which said that arms should not be contributed to a country if it is more likely than not that they will be used by the recipient to commit, facilitate, or aggravate the risk of genocide, crimes against humanity, or grave breaches of the 1949 Geneva Conventions.
How are these standards that you've laid out in these three different statutes, how are they assessed? I mean, does the statutes call for some type of mechanism to make these assessments, or is it out of state, or is it just sort of we make them as we go along?
Yeah, so there's two separate things here. One is the policy, which is non-binding, which the Biden administration's been saying a lot because they are not adhering to their own policy in transfers to Israel. Then there is the law, which in theory requires a certification from the president acting through the Secretary of State to Congress, essentially explaining what's going on, what munitions are being sent, what national emergency conditions are met. To my knowledge, that has not happened. It is possible that that went through in some sort of classified setting and did not get a lot of pushback in Congress. But to my knowledge, we have not seen that happen yet.
Do we have any other of these stores, essentially, and these type of channels for any other countries, any of our other allies?
We do. So we have war stockpile reserves positioned in the Indo-Pacific theater, mostly in South Korea. And I believe as well some in Eastern Europe now. But the levels of arms that are allowed to flow to them and the level of notification that is required for different allies to procure stocks from those stockpiles is different. And Israel has essentially had every loophole and cover over the years built into its use of this stockpile in a way that, to my knowledge, has not yet occurred with other allies.
Really disturbing story. And I mean, I imagine at one point there's going to be some type of reckoning, or maybe I imagine there won't be. I don't know. Maybe I'm thinking there should be.
The International Criminal Court has referred this situation for initial hearings. So we will see in the spring the assessments that the International Court makes. Particularly because, you know, the U.S. and Israel are not party to some aspects of the Geneva Conventions, but right. Palestine is. And so because it is being committed in the occupied Palestinian territories, probable war crimes are being committed in the occupied Palestinian territories. There's a sense that there could be further investigation and hopefully some form of accountability.
To your knowledge, has anybody asked, have any reporters asked the State Department legal corps or whatever the division of the State Department, if they have made any type of assessment like they did or begun assessing like they did with in regards to Yemen during the Obama administration?
A question was asked by a reporter yesterday, and I'm sorry, I do not remember her name, if they were making that determination. And they said that we have made no determination as of yet. So that means that something could be ongoing and they don't want to talk about it. Or it means that they don't want to look into it because often the purpose of executive department lawyers or executive branch lawyers is to preserve maximum policy flexibility for the president. So even though in theory there are these legal provisions that should be in effect, it is many of their jobs to find ways to find loopholes, maintain loopholes, certify emergency conditions, et cetera. That is the culture of executive branch lawyering.
Yes, I still remember John, was it Yu?
Oh, yes.
And torture.
Torture memos. He's still very successful in the field, by the way.
Yes, I think he's teaching at Stanford, isn't it? Is it at Stanford? Ari Tolany, Tolany, research consultant for Women for Weapons Trade Transparency. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. We'll put a link to that piece and to your organization in our podcast and YouTube descriptions.
Thanks so much.